Why avoidants fall in love with the empath they once rejected sounds almost cruel when you first hear it, because for the empath, rejection never feels clean, it feels unfinished. Like being emotionally invited in by someone who suddenly locked the door halfway through the connection and then acted confused about why you were hurt. And what makes this dynamic so psychologically devastating is that the avoidant often does feel something real. Sometimes something terrifyingly real. But instead of moving closer when love deepens, they panic, they disconnect, they convince themselves the relationship is too intense, too demanding, too emotionally consuming. Meanwhile, the empath sits there trying to understand how someone could make them feel so emotionally chosen one moment and so emotionally abandoned the next. And the strange part is, years later, it is often the avoidant who cannot forget the empath they pushed away. Not because the empath was perfect, not because the relationship was flawless, but because the empath reached emotional places inside them that very few people ever do. This is the part most people never talk about. Avoidants are not usually haunted by the people who kept things shallow. They are haunted by the people who made them feel emotionally visible before they were ready to be seen. And if you have ever wondered why an avoidant suddenly seems to realize your value after they already lost you, this video is going to explain the psychology behind it in a way that will probably change how you see the entire relationship. So subscribe if you are tired of surface-level dating advice and want the kind of emotional insight that makes confusing behavior finally click into place, because once you understand avoidant psychology deeply, you stop personalizing every mixed signal and start seeing the fear underneath it. One of the main reasons avoidants become emotionally attached to empaths is because empaths feel emotionally different from almost everyone else they encounter. Most people interact on the surface, conversations stay safe, emotional distance stays intact, vulnerability remains controlled. But empaths naturally move toward emotional depth without even trying. They notice subtle changes in energy, they sense sadness hidden beneath calmness, they ask questions that accidentally touch emotional wounds avoidants spent years learning how to hide. And at first this feels intoxicating to the avoidant. For perhaps the first time in a long time, they feel emotionally understood without having to explain themselves fully. The empath sees through the mask gently, not aggressively. They offer warmth without demanding perfection, presence without immediate judgment. And this creates something avoidants secretly crave but rarely trust: emotional safety. The problem is that emotional safety becomes emotionally dangerous once attachment begins forming. Because when someone starts seeing the real person underneath the emotional armor, avoidants can no longer fully hide inside detachment. Suddenly, their carefully controlled inner world is being witnessed by someone capable of understanding it. And while part of them deeply longs for that connection, another part becomes terrified by it, terrified of needing someone, terrified of emotional dependence, terrified that if another person truly sees them, rejection will hurt far more deeply than casual relationships ever could. This is why avoidants often feel unusually drawn to empaths very quickly. The emotional connection bypasses their normal defenses, but ironically, that same emotional depth later becomes the exact thing that activates their fear and triggers withdrawal. And beneath that withdrawal is one of the biggest internal conflicts avoidants live with. They desperately want to be understood while simultaneously fearing what happens when someone understands them too well. Most avoidants spend years surviving through emotional self-protection. They learn to stay composed, independent, emotionally controlled, not because they do not feel deeply, but because deep feelings often became associated with vulnerability, disappointment, pressure, or pain somewhere earlier in life. So they adapt by keeping emotional distance between themselves and others. But empaths disrupt that system naturally. They notice contradictions. They notice pain hidden behind humor. They notice loneliness beneath emotional independence. And for the avoidant, this creates a strange emotional exposure they are not fully prepared for, because being truly seen feels intimate in a way they cannot easily control. Suddenly there is another human being capable of recognizing the sadness behind their silence, the fear behind their withdrawal, the emotional hunger beneath their independence. And while this can feel beautiful at first, it also creates panic. Because once someone sees the real you, emotional rejection becomes far more threatening. It is no longer the rejection of a performance or a mask, it becomes the rejection of the hidden self underneath. This is why avoidants often start pulling away right when emotional intimacy deepens. Not because the connection means nothing, but because it suddenly means too much. The empath unintentionally reaches emotional territory the avoidant usually keeps sealed off even from themselves. And instead of leaning fully into that closeness, fear convinces them to create distance before vulnerability becomes unbearable. This is also why avoidants so often reject love at the exact moment it becomes real. To outsiders, the timing feels irrational, the relationship is becoming deeper, more emotionally secure, more connected than before, and suddenly the avoidant becomes distant, confused, emotionally inconsistent, or detached. But psychologically, this timing makes perfect sense. Early-stage connection feels manageable to avoidance because emotional investment is still limited. There is excitement, chemistry, attraction, curiosity, but once the relationship crosses into genuine emotional attachment, their nervous system starts sounding alarms internally. They begin feeling emotionally responsible to someone, needed by someone, vulnerable to loss, disappointment, and emotional dependency. And for avoidance, those feelings can feel suffocating even when the relationship itself is healthy. So they create space, sometimes subtly, sometimes abruptly. They convince themselves they need freedom, clarity, independence, or distance to think. But underneath those explanations is often fear of emotional engulfment. Fear that intimacy will consume their identity or expose emotional needs they have spent years suppressing. And this is what devastates so many empaths, because from their perspective, the relationship was finally becoming safe and emotionally meaningful when the avoidant suddenly pulled away. What they do not realize is that avoidants often flee not from lack of feelings, but from the intensity of feelings they do not know how to regulate. The deeper the connection becomes, the harder it becomes for them to maintain emotional control. So instead of staying and risking vulnerability, they retreat into emotional distance where things feel psychologically safer. But what avoidants often fail to understand in the moment is that the empath's emotional patience leaves a permanent imprint on them long after the relationship ends, because empaths love in a way that many avoidants have rarely experienced before. They listen deeply. They try to understand instead of immediately condemning. They offer compassion during emotional shutdowns that most people would walk away from immediately. And even though this patience can sometimes become unhealthy if boundaries disappear completely, it still affects the avoidant profoundly. Because somewhere deep inside, the avoidant recognizes how rare it is to be loved with that level of emotional gentleness. Even while pushing the empath away, part of them is absorbing the experience emotionally. They remember the calmness during their chaos, the understanding during their confusion, the way the empath kept trying to reach them emotionally instead of reducing them to their defenses. And often they do not fully appreciate this while the relationship is happening because fear keeps them emotionally distracted. But later, after distance creates emotional safety, the realization begins surfacing slowly. They start meeting other people who feel emotionally disconnected by comparison. Conversations feel shallower, relationships feel colder. The emotional depth they once resisted suddenly becomes something they quietly miss. And this is where the avoidance delayed grief often begins, because the empath did not simply offer attention or affection, they offered emotional presence, the kind that made the avoidant feel deeply human underneath all the emotional armor they spent years building. And eventually something strange starts happening after the empath is gone. The avoidant begins noticing that most new connections feel emotionally empty in comparison. At first, they may distract themselves easily. They throw themselves into work, routines, casual conversations, temporary attractions, anything that helps recreate the feeling of emotional control they lost during the deeper relationship. And on the surface, it may even look like they moved on effortlessly. This is what confuses so many empaths. They sit grieving the connection while the avoidant appears calm, detached, maybe even relieved. But avoidants often process loss in reverse. Their nervous system initially experiences distance as safety. The emotional pressure is gone. The vulnerability is gone. The expectation of closeness disappears. And because of that, they can temporarily convince themselves the separation was the right decision. But then time passes. New interactions begin feeling repetitive, emotionally shallow, predictable. They start realizing how rare it was to meet someone who truly understood them beneath the surface. Because the empath did not just offer chemistry, they offered emotional resonance, the kind of connection that reaches places avoidants normally keep disconnected from everyone around them. And once an avoidant experiences that level of emotional depth, it quietly becomes the standard their nervous system remembers, even if they once rejected it. Future relationships may feel easier emotionally, but they also feel emptier. Conversations lack the same emotional intimacy. Vulnerability feels absent. Nobody notices the hidden emotions the way the empath did, and this realization often hits avoidance slowly and privately, long after the relationship itself has ended. Because what they miss is not just the person, They miss the version of themselves that felt emotionally alive in that connection. And then comes the silence after the empath finally stops reaching out, and this is where many avoidants begin emotionally unraveling in ways nobody sees. As long as the empath continues chasing, hoping, checking in, trying to repair the connection, the avoidant can remain psychologically protected inside emotional distance. They know the bond still exists, they know the door is still emotionally open. But when the empath truly detaches, when the warmth disappears, when the emotional pursuit finally ends, something shifts violently inside the avoidant's internal world, because suddenly the loss becomes real, final, irreversible. And what makes this moment so psychologically powerful is that avoidants often suppress grief until emotional reality can no longer be avoided. While the empath was emotionally available, the avoidant could keep postponing vulnerability. But once the connection feels truly gone, the emotions they delayed begin surfacing all at once. Memories become louder, regret becomes sharper, emotional numbness starts cracking, they replay conversations they once dismissed casually. They remember moments of tenderness they failed to fully appreciate in real time, and perhaps most painfully, they begin realizing the empath was not simply emotionally attached to them, the empath genuinely understood them in ways they may never fully experience again. This delayed emotional collapse is one of the most misunderstood parts of avoidant psychology because from the outside it looks inconsistent. Why grieve now instead of earlier? Why suddenly care after pushing someone away? But emotionally, avoidants often need distance before they feel safe enough to fully access emotions they suppressed during intimacy itself. The tragedy is that by the time those feelings surface clearly, the empath is often already emotionally exhausted from waiting. And once distance creates enough emotional safety, avoidants frequently begin romanticizing the very empath they once rejected. This is where memory becomes dangerous. Because without the pressure of real intimacy, the avoidant can finally revisit the relationship emotionally without triggering the same level of panic that closeness once caused. They start idealizing the warmth, the connection, the emotional understanding. They remember the way the empath looked at them with patience instead of judgment, the way conversations felt emotionally alive, the way someone finally saw through their emotional walls instead of staying trapped at the surface. And because the relationship now exists mostly in memory rather than active vulnerability, it suddenly feels emotionally safer to love. This is why avoidants often appear more emotionally expressive after separation than they ever did during the relationship itself. Distance removes the immediate threat of emotional engulfment while preserving the emotional bond internally. So feelings they once ran from become easier to process privately. They begin replaying old messages, revisiting memories late at night, wondering what would have happened if fear had not controlled so many of their decisions. And what makes this especially painful is that many avoidants genuinely do not understand their own emotional patterns while the relationship is happening. In the moment, they interpret emotional intensity as pressure or discomfort. Only later do they realize it was intimacy they were experiencing, not danger. And by then, the empath they once took for granted has often become emotionally unreachable, existing more as an emotional ghost than a real relationship they can easily return to. Another reason avoidants fall so deeply for the empath they rejected is because the empath unintentionally triggered emotional growth they were not prepared for. Most avoidants spend years carefully avoiding unresolved emotional wounds. They stay distracted, independent, detached enough to avoid confronting painful insecurities beneath the surface. But deep emotional relationships break through those protective systems. Empaths especially have a way of activating hidden emotional material because they naturally encourage introspection, vulnerability, and emotional honesty simply through the way they connect. And while this can initially feel healing, it also becomes deeply destabilizing for avoidants. Suddenly, old fears rise to the surface: fear of abandonment, fear of not being enough, fear of losing control emotionally, fear of needing someone too deeply. The empath becomes a mirror reflecting wounds the avoidant spent years escaping. And instead of understanding that this discomfort is part of emotional growth, the avoidant often misinterprets it as a sign that the relationship itself is the problem. So they run from the person triggering the emotions rather than recognizing the emotions were already living inside them all along. But later, after separation creates space for reflection, many avoidants begin understanding what actually happened. They realize the empath was not trying to trap them emotionally. The relationship was simply exposing emotional realities they had never fully dealt with before. And once that realization begins settling in, the avoidant often develops a completely different understanding of the connection they once rejected so impulsively. And perhaps one of the deepest realizations avoidants eventually face is that what they truly miss is not the attention the empath gave them, but the emotional safety they felt in the empath's presence. Because attention is easy to replace temporarily. Validation can be found in many places, but genuine emotional safety is rare, especially for people who struggle trusting intimacy in the first place. The empath offered a kind of acceptance that allowed the avoidant to feel emotionally human beneath all the defenses. They did not just admire the polished version, they cared about the wounded version too, the confused version, the emotionally guarded version, and this kind of acceptance affects avoidants more deeply than they usually admit because so much of their emotional life is built around hiding vulnerable parts of themselves from the world. The empath made those hidden parts feel less shameful, less unlovable, less alone. And after the relationship ends, avoidants often discover how difficult that feeling is to recreate elsewhere. Other relationships may provide attraction, excitement, distraction, even temporary companionship. But the emotional safety feels missing. Nobody else seems to understand the silence behind their distance. Nobody else notices the emotions hiding beneath detachment in quite the same way. And this is often the moment avoidants finally recognize the true value of what they lost. Not because the empath was perfect, but because the connection gave them something their nervous system secretly craved the entire time: the rare experience of feeling emotionally accepted without needing to hide who they really were underneath the armor. And this is exactly why avoidants so often return after long periods of silence, sometimes months or even years later, acting as though the emotional connection never fully disappeared. To the empath, this return can feel shocking, confusing, even unfair. Because while they were grieving openly, healing painfully, trying to rebuild themselves after emotional rejection, the avoidant seemed absent, detached, unreachable. But internally, avoidants often process attachment much slower than people realize. They suppress emotions during the relationship itself, then slowly begin accessing those emotions only after enough distance removes the immediate fear